Hello, everyone. Welcome to a moment in time in history. Today, I want to talk about President Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation. We know that Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809. We know he was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. by John Wilkes Booth on April 14, 1865. Disappointingly, he was there attending a play titled Our American Cousin, written by Tom Taylor. And he didn't die that evening, but he would die the very next day on April 15th, 1865. Now, there are more than 14,000 books that have been written about Lincoln, so there are many interpretations that one is likely to develop about him. But we must remember there are many facts that cannot be hidden or ignored. We know that Abraham Lincoln is forever tied to his many debates with Southern Democratic Stephen A. Douglas. Their battles were known for the U.S. Senate and for the state of Illinois, to include the presidential election of 1860, in which Lincoln defeated him. Although Lincoln didn't defeat him for the race for Senate, but he was able to defeat him for the presidential nomination. Lincoln served as the United States president from 1861 to 1865, and disappointingly, we have to open our arms to Andrew Johnson, and that is a whole nother topic that we will not get into. Now, I just want to let you know some things that you may not know. Lincoln is one of the first presidents to ever appear on a United States coin. This happened in 1909. The year is significant because it marks the 100th year of his birthday of 1809. Remember, as I said, he was born 1809. He was also the first president to declare Thanksgiving as a national holiday on the last Thursday of November in 1863. Now, I want to talk briefly about the Gettysburg Address, and I think it's very important. And this is going to be an address that's going to take place at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We all know in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, is going to be the last time that the Confederate soldiers will invade the North. All right, they will never be able to invade the North territory thereafter. So this is going to be the battle where Confederates will not be able to invade the North again. And this is a special event where Lincoln was not the guest. He was a guest speaker, but he was not the original guest speaker. The real guest speaker is going to be Edward Everett. Edward Everett, a man who is prominent. He was a Harvard College president. He was president at Harvard University. He was also a ambassador to Britain, Secretary of State. He spoke very well. He knew how to use his words eloquently. He's going to speak for more than 2 hours, yet no one is going to recall what Mr. Edward Everett ever said. Lincoln is going to talk for less than 3 minutes, and everyone's going to remember his wonderful words of choice that he will have on the people. And I will read just 2 paragraphs of his Gettysburg Address. I won't read all 3. The last one is quite thick, and I don't want to read all that. So I will explain to you what a score means. That's important because he begins his speech with 7 years ago. 1 score equals 20 years. 20 years times 4 give us 80, and plus the 7, 87 years. So 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, taking just a little bit from the Declaration of Independence. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this field had endured a battle. There were many men scattered throughout this field, dead for weeks. And the people in that community had to endure this stench, this odor of the dead. People who had sacrificed. brother against brother, dividing families, all because of their different views and their agendas that they had. Was it about slavery or was it about states' rights? That's for you to decide. But this was a special event. It was supposed to be a special event. It was supposed to be the guest speaker, Edward Everett. But Abraham Lincoln's speech under 3 minutes will provide wisdom, knowledge, and understanding on where America needs to go. Now, this flag below Lincoln is the United States of America flag. However, you will know that there's only 35 stars versus the 50. Today, there's 50 states, which means there's 50 stars in the flag. And during the time of 1863 to 1865, there were only 35 states in the Union. So that's why we only have the 35 stars. So without talking much more, let's begin and talk about Lincoln Emancipation Proclamation. So the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. And it's important for us to know that the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was drafted on July 22nd, 1862, before it was published on September 1862. So this wasn't just something that, mysteriously appeared on January 1 of 1863. A lot of thought went into the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln didn't operate solo on this. There was a lot of input. Now, Lincoln was going through a number of things other than the war itself. We often forget that Abraham Lincoln was a father of 4 boys. Before 1863, he would lose 2 boys. One was Edward Baker Lincoln. He died when he was just 3 years old. And then, of course, we have William Wallace, known as Willie. Many people know him as Willie. He was one of the first young men to die in the White House. And Lincoln was very close to Willie, and that really affected Lincoln. Not that the death of Eddie didn't affect him, but he was very close to Willie. And he loved Tad and he loved Robert, but Willie was one of his precious boys. But where I'm going with this is that Lincoln is trying to operate as a father, he's trying to operate as a husband, and he's also trying to operate as a commander-in-chief, president, and a soldier in his own right. He's trying to appease many people. He wants to do the right thing. He was hesitant on the Emancipation Proclamation, but he was forced to implement it. And this is why some people view it as leverage, that is control. And that was the control the states where slavery existed. But it did not phase the southern states as it did the border states, and we will learn this soon. And the border states were Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. And you'll learn more about the border states as I go into my next slide. So what are border states? Well, these are states, these are southern slave states that border northern free states that did not succeed, or you can say leave the Union. Okay, they thought about leaving the Union. They wanted to leave the Union, but then at times they wanted to stay with the Union. They were indecisive. Now, Jefferson Davis, you see to my left, and before I continue reading, I'll just introduce you to Mr. Jefferson Davis. He was the first president and the last president of the Confederate States of America. And he's an important figure that we should recognize and know much about. He was also born in rural Kentucky, as Lincoln was. Jefferson Davis served as president of the Confederate States of America from February 9th, 1861 to April 9th, 1865. April 9th, 1865 obviously was the end of his presidency because it was a historical day where General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant in Appomattox, Virginia. So now, had Jefferson Davis, getting back to the Emancipation Proclamation, had Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Confederate soldier, rejoined the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation would have likely not been issued. Why? It would have ended the war. There was no need for the war to continue if he rejoined the Union. We have to remember, Lincoln was all about preserving the Union, protecting the Union. He was indifferent about slavery. He wanted to contain it in the southern states, and with the hopes that it will die out. That was his way of putting the flames out. And it would have died out. It would have taken time, but it would have died out if it was only contained in the South, because people in the North did not want it, and people west of the Mississippi did not want it in those territories. Remember, those territories were primarily reserved for Europeans, and at that time, the Irish and let me think here. It was the Irish and Germans. Irish and Germans. There it is. Had to recall. Had a little brain fart there, but I recalled it. So the Germans and the Irish were taking over those territories, and although there were African Americans there as well, but those lands and territories were reserved for Europeans. So we have to remember and understand that Lincoln's objective from the onset was to preserve the Union, not abolish slavery where it existed. This is very true, and many historians will back me on this. He was clear about keeping slavery contained in the southern states and preventing it from spreading into the western territories and into northern states, although it had already ended in those northern territories. But this was before the Civil War had begun. And had Lincoln had his way of just keeping slavery in the South and Southerners agreeing to his plan, there would not have been the Civil War. And slavery would have ended. It would have died out. Because you had the few African Americans that had fled out west of the Mississippi, who saw better opportunities for them, that is freedom, job opportunities. This is where we get our first original cowboys in that area. This is where we get people fleeing to states like Kansas. They didn't have the best jobs, but it was better than being overseen by white Southerners and having to do hard labor. So this is how we get our first Black African American cowboys. And as you progress in your history, you will learn about these men. They were protectors, as we will call today, something like law enforcement. They protected those new settlers from the Indians. Remember, we were invading Indian territories when we went out west. But that's another topic. We won't get into that. But the key here is to understand that Lincoln was about preserving the Union. even if it meant freeing no slaves, freeing all slaves, or freeing some slaves. All that he did, he said it was all about preserving the Union. We have to understand, and we should know, that slavery no longer existed in the New England states and mid Atlantic regions before Abraham Lincoln was elected. Slavery had already been abolished there. America had two different agendas on achieving prosperity. Although African Americans were free in the northern states, they lacked true equality. Free, but they weren't equal, such as social and economic opportunities to include the right to vote in many states other than New England. So, what does it all mean? What does the Emancipation Proclamation actually mean? Well, emancipation meaning liberation, meaning freedom, proclamation meaning special announcement, a declaration. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order that freed African Americans from slavery in the South only. It did not apply to border states. It did not apply to Western territories. It did not apply to those states in the North, although those areas had pretty much done away with it. But where it really hurt and where it really failed many people of color was in those border states where slavery existed. Emancipation Proclamation was not effective in those areas. So we're going to find out what really freed people from bondage, what really freed those who were under contract of the indentured servitude. Now we have to make sure that we don't turn 75 before we understand what did the Emancipation Proclamation do for most African Americans, since it was pretty much designed for them, because it was not designed for any other race or ethnic group. The Emancipation Proclamation allowed for African American soldiers, allowed African Americans to join the Union Army. Okay, so they weren't soldiers first. So the African Americans became soldiers and they were able to join the Union Army during the Civil War. One of the most recognizable regiments during the Civil War was the 54th Massachusetts, that was led by Black abolitionists. It was not an easy task for African American soldiers. Many endured racism and segregation. In addition, they were likely handed a brutal sentence if captured by Confederate soldiers. They were likely tortured, disfigured, or killed just because the color, the texture of their skin. African Americans were not provided equal medical treatment and salary. Think about that. You're fighting in a war. This is the Civil War. And you can't even get medical treatment. You can't even get the same salary as those of white men. You're not being treated equally. You're being discriminated against. There's so much hatred towards you, even in those states where slavery did not exist. You were not truly welcome. There were plans to send you back to Africa. There were plans to exterminate you. But African Americans were always a willing participant to show that they were worthy to be a part of this great nation, the United States of America. African Americans were often forced during the Civil War in non-combative jobs and non-confrontational jobs, but they were often provided jobs that were hard laboring that whites did not want. Many Northerners did not vision African Americans as having courage to even fight for their freedom when faced with adversity. Eventually, African Americans fought in many battles, and they did well for themselves. They did well for their country, and they proved to the Union Army that without them, they could not win. So it was a united front that made the Union soldiers victorious over the Confederate Army. So what ended slavery? We know a combination of many things. We know it wasn't just one thing. We know it was not the Emancipation Proclamation. It was just an executive order. It was not law. But it was a lot of changes that took place that helped end slavery. Industrialization. People in the government, not everyone were racist, all right? Not everyone. Church leaders, abolitionists, but most important, the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. The 13th Amendment is one of President Lincoln's greatest accomplishments that was supported by Congress. It was passed by the House of Representatives on January 31st, 1865. On December 6, 1865, it was approved. Although Lincoln had passed away, but he got it pushed through the House of Representatives. And once they make it through the House, it's gold. It made slavery and indentured servitude illegal. If you read the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, you know that. And there's nothing written about what the Emancipation Proclamation did, because it did absolutely, really, and I hate to disappoint, it did nothing. Because we can't free individuals in a section of the United States and not free all individual. Because slavery still existed in the border states. Although they were part of the Union, there were still slaves there. What about those people? If slavery, if the slaves were freed by Lincoln, then why did we still have people that were slaves in those border states that I mentioned previously? Something to think about. So it's the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves, not the Emancipation Proclamation. Thanks for watching, folks. My name is Rick, and I hope to have more history for you soon.